This week we will talk more about segregation. Last time, remember, we had talked about the big sort, and now we'll kind of make the connection to analytical sociology and how segregation is not only an important topic by itself, but also how it sort of represents this idea of analytical sociology, that there's a macro phenomena, it comes about through the micro level actions, interactions of the individuals, and sometimes the macro level pattern that we observe is actually what nobody wants, right? Because of the way they interact with each other, and because of the social dynamics that are underlying this, right? So that's sort of the idea. So today we get started with segregation dynamics, and on Thursday we will continue that a little more. On Thursday it will be a little more abstract than today in last lecture, but it still hopefully is going to be understandable. As with so many things, the actual core of it is quite simple, right? Sometimes there's a lot of fuzz around things, but the core of it is often very simple, and that's what it is in this case as well. Okay, so this is what I brought with me for today. We have a brief catch-up on segregation, and then again, like into residential segregation a little more. Also talking about what is actually going on there, and then hopefully there you'll understand this distinction between something we observe at the macro level, like segregation, right, and something that occurs on the individual level, which is discrimination. People not liking others, right? People discriminating others for their race or ethnicity and so on, and how the two things need to be separated, right? And that's the whole idea of the ecological fallacy as well. I don't know, we need to separate these kind of things. As sociologists, we look at the macro level phenomena, but we always need to think about the individuals that are part of that and how they act and interact with each other. Okay, anyways, then I have actually a bit of a longer video today on desegregation. Let's see how that goes. I just thought it was a pretty cool video about how they try to get rid of segregation in American high schools. Actually, it was a huge initiative since the 1970s where they kind of bust people around the country. I don't know, they basically bust white people into black neighborhoods and blacks into predominantly white neighborhoods to mix up the composition at schools. And then actually this is a really nice video that shows at the end of the day how as soon as they stop this, nowadays, a few years ago, how the whole thing goes to shit again and how actually the whole thing disappears. Which actually tells us that there seem to be some other forces at play. That it's not just discrimination at the individual level. Assuming that nowadays we are actually I hope so, we are much more tolerant than, let's say, 40 years ago. Anyway, then we talk about the segregation process and age-based models, but that's setting the scene for what's going to come on Thursday. So segregation. We talked about it at length the last time. Let me just bring up the definition again. Segregation is the separation of individuals into distinct parts of social life. Yeah, and that can be very different. It is a relatively broad, abstract definition, But, fill it with life. It could be residential segregation. Yeah, I don't know, certain ethnic groups living in certain neighborhoods, and I'm telling you a little bit about my own work, where we looked at that in Stockholm. Believe it or not, but there's quite a bit of ethnic segregation going on in Sweden. We would not have thought it, but there is. And as it turns out, it's actually white avoidance driving that, but I don't know, let's not worry too much about that. We could observe it in the workplace. Yeah. People with beards standing in front of you as professors teaching you. That's workplace segregation. This in your networks, right? The people that you know, they are incredibly similar to you, much more than you think. And we talked about segregation in schools. Yeah? And historically, as I mentioned, it used to be that really there were like incredibly segregated schools in the United States, where this was a major issue. But even in Ireland, we do have that. We have Catholic schools. There, it's not race. It's it's confession. And we have Catholic schools. We have mixed schools. We have Protestant schools and so on. Right? It's like the separation of individuals into distinct parts of social life, through these kind of institutions. And with respect to school segregation, actually I have a first little video which hopefully shows you that this is still a problem. Yeah? Okay. So it's an interesting, cute
Segregation is when black and white are separate and not together.
Children of color and white children are separated.
There are two different schools, and one is for black people and another one is for white people.
Segregation happens, but it's not like happening as bad as it did before, because before it used to be even worse.
In my class, there's Julia, and she's white, and there's me.
Well, my cousin named Lana, she used to go to a Catholic school. Well, she felt awkward because she was the only black person.
The only other people from the Middle East in the school is my cousins.
Because some people might decide to fit in with the people of the opposite race, but some people might not feel comfortable around people that isn't part of their race.
I've been to a school named PS85, so there were separate classes, English and Spanish, so it wasn't really fair because before I didn't know any English. I only speak Spanish.
I have a sister. She goes to a Catholic school, and her name is Hennessy, and it's a school for rich people, and she had an opportunity to go, but you don't really see a lot of colored people, but there still is, but there's more white people that you see in the school.
One main reason I think that is because of the money too. Private schools tend to be more expensive. I think that schools are segregated based on where you live, because people of color live with people of color and white people live with other white people.
My mom was looking at a school for me to go to, and the population for whites was really large, and the blacks were really small. I think one of the reasons they did that was because, number one, they still think whites are better, and number two, because segregation is illegal and they still feel like whites are better, they want mainly white people, but having one or two black people and a couple Latino, it makes them seem like not totally white.
Well, I think diversity is good because we won't only have people that are from your culture. You have different people, you could talk to different people. You won't be talking to the same people.
Okay, so why did I show you this video? Well, first of all, did you see, hang on, actually this is still going on, right? It's actually changing people's lives in many ways. It's sometimes more prevalent than we would have thought. They already talk about different kind of potential ideas about why is there still segregation going on, and that's what you as a sociologist need to immediately think about. Remember, you see a social phenomena, and you immediately need to come up with 3-4 explanations, bang, 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 and then the work actually starts, right, to figure that out. But bottom line is we do observe still quite a bit of segregation. Even though after the Fair Housing Act and all these other civil rights movements on in the States, I showed you with respect to residential segregation, this is something we had last time. This is a map of New York. This is data from 2015. Colored dots stands for 1,000 people from different ethnic groups. And what you see is immediately, well, you see a pretty segregated world, right? You see a pretty segregated world. And now we could think, hang on, people are they still racist? Is there sort of discrimination going on? What is actually driving this? But first of all, let me mention, when we talk about, residential segregation, there's so many actors in here that we need to talk about as well, yeah? You talked about the individuals, but there's also sellers of apartments. There are landlords, there are, politicians. There's so many other players involved here, right? It's not necessarily just the individual that makes a decision to live there, to take their job or whatnot. actually some very interesting research colleagues of mine in Sweden did. They also like a very nice design, but now it's common, but I still really like it. It's, they send fake applications to employers. They send fake applications to employers of fake candidates, which have pretty much the same qualifications, except that the one has a Muslim-sounding name and the other doesn't, right? And then they actually kind of see how many times do those fake candidates get invited for an interview. And then they this kind of design people use in the housing market, I don't know, in jobs, and they do find discrimination of employers. There you see, you can actually really disentangle the thing because you control the applicant side. You can design an applicant that is equivalent in terms of skills and qualifications. You have two, and the only thing is your experimental condition is like one has like a different sounding name, right? And then you see how the response is different to these kind of things. But anyway, let's get started and debunk one theory. It's going to be, let's call it common sense theory, which is that there is segregation because people don't like each other. Now we could say, okay, this is like crazy, but the sociological way is, okay, let's take something and then debunk it. Yeah. So the argument now is there is segregation because people discriminate at the individual level. People don't like other people who are different from them. That's a fair enough point. I don't know. Let's check if that can be responsible for the segregation that we observe. And it's probably the one that comes to your mind immediately, right? You think, okay, macro level thing, segregation, micro level thing, people discriminate, people are racist. Yeah. Okay. What I'm going to show you is that empirically this does not hold. Yeah. And I'm going to use actually Elster now to demonstrate that. So if this would be the case, if there is segregation because people don't like others who are dissimilar to themselves, if that would be true, then in high tolerance regions or cities there should be lower segregation than in. If that would be true, high tolerance regions should have lower segregation than low tolerance regions. Yeah. So let's say, I don't know, we are in a city and there people are very tolerant. There should be less segregation than somewhere else in another city where people are not that tolerant. If it is about the individual's tolerance level, I don't know, not liking others who are dissimilar to themselves, that is driving it. Another thing that would have to be true, if our explanation is a good one, would be, if that would be true, increase in approval of integration. Let's say over time, people approve integration more and more. You ask them again over the years, do you think integration is a good thing? And if you would observe that people say more and more, yes, integration is a good thing, which is what they do, this should also lead to a decrease in residential segregation in these areas, where people become more tolerant. Okay, now I'm using data. I'm using data from actually two sources. One is Coleman and the other Sheetsley, but do not worry about that. So what you see here is a table. First of all, you see years on the one side. This is data from the 1940s to 1968. That's one thing, and then you see numbers here. Let's first talk about what these numbers are. The numbers is basically a number, it could be from 0 to 100, and 0 means no segregation, and 100 means lots of segregation. Yeah, we can measure these things in very different ways. I don't know, this uses the index of segregation. It measures the percentage of blacks who would have to move in order to achieve homogenization between the two races, so that then it would be actually equally mixed. Yeah? It's actually not that trivial. What is complete mixing? It's actually not that trivial. Yeah. But now let's just take that there are different indicators for different indices for segregation. 0 means no segregation, 100 means total segregation. They're only black and white neighborhoods, while 0 means they are all mixed. Yeah? This is where we're at. Okay, so now you see data for the north and the south in the US, northern states, southern states, and you see data for residential segregation. These are the numbers that I talked about. And then you see percentage of whites approving to residential segregation in the columns next to it. Okay, so remember what I said, like if segregation is because people don't like others who are dissimilar to themselves, if that would be true, high tolerance regions, cities should have lower segregation than low tolerance regions or cities. Okay, let's first compare the people from the south and the north. Remember this is directly after the war. Actually the American Civil War is actually, still far away, but still you could see a big difference in northern states versus southern states. What you see here is that the numbers in the north are higher than in the south. regardless of the time, right? In 1940, 42% of the whites in the North, they approved residential integration, while only 12% of the whites in the South approved residential segregation. Yeah? So basically the story here is people in the north of the US are more tolerant in those days, 1940s, 1950s, 60s, and so on. Yeah? Hopefully nowadays it's different, but that's how it was. Okay, so now think about that, what I just said. If that would be true, high tolerance regions should have lower segregation than low tolerance regions. Actually, but it's still high in both, to be honest. Yeah? In 1960, we see a bit of a difference between the South and the North, but in the 1950s and the 1940s, we don't really see a difference. Actually, in the 1940s, there was more segregation in the North than in the South. So when we compare these two things with each other, people in the North of the US are more tolerant, but segregation is still high, both in the North and the South. You see, our explanations doesn't seem to cut it here, because it doesn't explain something that would have to be true as well, if our explanation would be what is driving things, if it is about individuals discriminating people. So, we can debunk this a little bit. Yeah? Let's try our second implication that would have to be true if it is about. So here we go, the first one is done. Let's focus on the second one. So if it is about people discriminating, then increases in approval of integration should lead to decreases in residential segregation. As people become more, in favor of integration, you ask them, they say, yeah, integration is a great thing, I love it. Yeah? Then segregation should go down. Let's look at that. So now let's look at the data over time. Yeah, what you now see is the approval ratings. Now let's look at them combined. It doesn't really matter that the North differs from the South here. The key here right now is when you go from the 1940s to the 1960s, that in both cases approval goes up. Right? So people seem to become more tolerant. People, while in the 1940s only 12% of the whites in the South approved residential integration, while in the 1960s, like almost 60% approved of it. Same thing in the North, but there we start higher and then we move to even more approval, to 80%. Okay, but now let's look at residential segregation over time. Well, but from 1940 to the 1960s, segregation actually increases in the South, while in the North it goes up a little bit and then it goes down, but you don't really see a clear trend that segregation goes down, right? So on the one side, we have the approval going up of integration, but we don't really have the hypothesized or the implicated decline in residential segregation that our explanation here would suggest. So in a way, we can debunk that here too. Yeah? It's not really the case. So now we had like two alternative things that would have to be true if our explanation would be driving things, but none of that seems to be the case. So maybe our explanation is not that good to begin with. Maybe there's something else going on, right? And this is then the segregation process that we get to. So why is there segregation? And why does it not go away when people become more tolerant? Now that's actually a very important question, because you could say that, okay, well, we need to become more tolerant. People become more tolerant, but we still have segregation. So what the fuck is going on? Okay, so what I have now is a little longer video about desegregation. With desegregation, we mean the process of actively reducing segregation. That's what they did in the case of schools. So we're coming back to school segregation. As you'll see, it gives you a nice little background about, this thing where students were basically bussed around through the country to go to different schools in a way, and how as soon as they stopped that, segregation came up again. Yeah? So now this is a bit of a longer video, but it's interesting nevertheless, I think.
Many communities are struggling with the complex and highly emotional problem of busing.
In 1971, Charlotte, North Carolina opened the door for busing across the country, forcing the nation to confront a history of old prejudices.
And I asked them if they knew about the niggers going into school the next day, and they said, I'm against it.
Well-honed politics.
I'm against busing. That's forced integration.
And long-held fears of change.
It's not integration, it's communism.
Charlotte overcame these hurdles, becoming a national symbol of what was possible.
On the whole, integration has gone more smoothly here and has been more successful than many people imagined.
But more than 4 decades later, the story of Charlotte's integration has taken a decidedly different turn. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that schools divided along racial lines were inherently unequal. But over the next decade, only about 1% of blacks in the South ended up attending integrated schools. Arthur Griffin was among the students affected by the slow pace of change.
My elementary schooling was all black. There was a morning session from 8 to 12, and there was an afternoon session from 12 to 4. Because it was overcrowded, we had those 2 shifts. My high school was all black. We had old books, we had old football uniforms, and had old band uniforms. This went on for years.
This inequality in Charlotte led to a federal lawsuit. When the Supreme Court ruling finally came in 1971, the effects rippled across the country.
A unanimous Supreme Court today affirmed the principle of busing school children to desegregate schools. In fact, the court said almost anything was all right if it served this purpose.
The effects of this decision are almost incalculable.
How many are going to keep their children home? Home, not on a bus, nowhere but home.
Charlotte's desegregation program had already been set in motion by a federal judge a year and a half before.
The people of this community will not accept nor comply with these oppressive orders.
What happens if the school board should bring legal action against you for keeping him home?
I guess I'll get free board and meals.
To keep whites in the school district, most of the students who were bused were black. The students sent to West Charlotte High, the pride of the black community, were an exception.
Immediately when the decision was made that white kids would now be bused into West Charlotte, it was like a community joke. Like overnight, the gravel parking lot was paved. The athletic facilities in terms of the football stadium, basketball, gymnasium stuff was upgraded. It was like overnight someone had written a check for $1 million.
That first year was not an easy one, as black and white students found themselves under a microscope, walking down halls with other races for the first time.
I had come from this lily white neighborhood, and I never knew that there was so much color.
West Charlotte High School used to be all black, and during that first year there was racial fighting and boycotts by some whites.
Students were injured during some of the incidents as tension between black and white students grew.
It had always been a black school, and they had very much pride, which I understand. You know, they were proud of their football team and proud of their cheerleaders and proud of their majorettes. Because I was a majorette, I had 5 girls jump me one day. It was very unsettling. I didn't realize that there were good things to come. It was just going to take time.
It has been 3 years since the Supreme Court handed down its historic decision, requiring extensive crosstown busing of students in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system. In fact, attendance for the first day was near a record for the public schools.
I don't think the parents adjusted to the integration as quickly as the kids did, because we were down in the trenches dealing with each other day to day. If you look at it as a battle being fought, we were the ones that were actually the soldiers, and we were on the front line.
The example set at West Charlotte High School turned it into a darling of the national media.
4 students from Boston schools plagued by a busing controversy were in class in Charlotte, North Carolina today.
Students have been promoting school spirit and togetherness.
And while desegregation hasn't worked perfectly in Charlotte, it has worked.
We were thrown together at first, but we've learned to adjust to each other, and we all get along a whole lot better.
I think busing was a tremendous success. The fact that my children and my neighbors' children, even to this day, are friends. And as you can see, I'm African American. My neighbors' children were white.
I don't know how you could have changed anything if it had not been for busing.
In the decades since Charlotte's integration, the debate has raged over the long-term effects of busing. Researchers like Professor Rosalind Mickelson have sought to answer that question through her analysis of a massive database of studies at the University of North Carolina.
Children who attended diverse schools scored better on tests. They were more likely to graduate, to avoid crime. They're more likely to go to college, graduate from college. There is growing evidence that white middle-class children and middle-class children from all ethnic and racial backgrounds also benefit academically and socially from going to integrated schools.
Good evening. We're going to begin this evening with the most deeply vexing issue in the history of America.
In 1999, a new generation began to confront the legacy of busing, and the TV cameras turned again to Charlotte. In response to a lawsuit, a federal judge said that the district's busing program had been a success, but his ruling didn't stop there.
Federal Judge Robert Potter essentially said the district had met its constitutional duty by successfully creating a single school system serving all children regardless of race, and he said that no more need be done.
It's going to now be the quality of education being prioritized over the racial quotas.
The parents who had brought the suit were white, some of them transplants from other cities where busing hadn't been done. But some black residents also had reservations. Academics had improved, but not always as much as parents had hoped. And as the city spread out, many grew tired of the logistical pretzel that busing had become.
Now, in pockets all over the country,
Charlotte wasn't alone.
School districts are asking other courts for permission to go back to the old neighborhood school system.
We need to get school officials out of the business of racial engineering and into the business of providing an adequate education for all students.
Our babies need our parents. They need that ownership. They need to know that mom, dad, uncle, and grandma are just a step away.
Arthur Griffin was against Charlotte's decision to stop mandatory busing.
I just decided not to run for school board anymore, simply because I was out of step. So rather than obstructing the course of events, I said, I'll just step aside and I won't try to stop you, and we'll see what happens. And it took a year or two or three before West Charlotte actually got to the point that it is today.
In the 1970s, West Charlotte was a national model for school integration, 40% black, 60% white. Today, it's 88% black, 1% white.
I think you saw some white flight and some bright flight.
I'm sorry, say it again. What kind of flight?
White flight and bright flight, where the black middle class folks were leaving too.
It wasn't an instant death, but you allowed great teachers to leave. You allowed great numbers of students with great needs to bubble up to West Charlotte, and the resources were not there to help those kids be successful.
School districts across the country have followed in Charlotte's wake. Places like Seminole County, Florida in 2006, Little Rock, Arkansas in 2007, Galveston County, Texas in 2009. Today, nearly 2/3 of the school districts originally under court order to desegregate are no longer required to do so. Demographic forces are also working against integration. The growing ranks of minority students, particularly Latinos, has meant that even in the melting pot of New York City, half of the public schools are more than 90% Black and Hispanic.
The schools across the nation are approaching levels of segregation that we saw prior to the 1970s.
One established benefit of busing had been to quietly mix students of different income levels and social classes, but that too has been dismantled, as Black and Latino students today typically attend schools where nearly 65% of the kids are poor.
We basically have two systems going on right now, one for the haves and one for the have-nots. We are a lot more segregated, both racially and economically, than I think anyone would have imagined would occur.
So what do we take from this? Even like 50, 60 years later, even though tolerance levels increased, people are more happy to live in diverse worlds, as soon as you take that bus out, it falls back. So what is going on? Like, why is there segregation, and why does it not go away when people become more tolerant? Or actually now you could also ask the question, why does it come back as soon as you kind of take those buses out? Okay, in order to make sense of that, now what we're going to do, we'll talk about the segregation process. So the segregation process is different from segregation. Here I have a definition from Brook and Mayer. They say segregation is the non-random allocation of people who belong to different groups into social positions and the associated social and physical distances between groups. It's just a fancy way of just saying, I don't know, according to certain social attributes, we are separated in whatever form. Yeah. Okay, segregation per se is a static property of a population. Now it's becoming interesting because this is actually what we observe at the end of the day, right? I go in and I kind of measure like what is the mix and let's go. That's what segregation is. Whereas, and now it comes, segregation processes are the actions that create and sustain segregation. Are these things different? Actually, yes, they are different. And this is sort of now where it comes into play, where we talk about the actions and that create and sustain this segregation. Okay. Think about this picture here again. We have like segregation. This is our lovely Coleman boat. We see it. Segregation is the phenomena, macro-level phenomena that we want to explain at the end of the day. This is the segregation process. And it's sort of what brings about that pattern at the end of the day. And analytical sociology, you'll be concerned with exactly these kind of processes. Yeah? I don't know, what do I have here? Explaining important macro-level facts and middle-value blah, 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 but detailing in clear and precise ways the mechanisms. Okay. So you read these kind of things and sometimes you think like, oh, this is like a no-brainer and so on. But no, there's actually something about it. There's a difference between the one thing at the top here and the process that brings it about. Yeah? And if you want to understand the thing on the top, you need to think about the process that brought it about. Okay, so what are things that kind of could drive things? Well, individual preferences for own groups, but then, people brought up economic inequalities among groups, combined with price differences. Maybe people just cannot afford to live. I couldn't afford to buy an apartment in Dublin 4. It tells you about my shitty salary. Anyway, I wanted to live in the diverse neighborhood anyway. It could be discrimination and racial steering, real estate agents. There could be other players in this. The point here is we have action and we have an effect. We have like a feedback that kind of matters here. And this is where the segregation process really is different from segregation by itself. So one thing changing the other thing, changing the other thing, and so on. First of all, I leave my neighborhood. I left the Grand Canal Docks area, becoming a little less cooler now. Or maybe it becomes cooler because I'm gone. Probably it becomes more expensive, I don't know, because I couldn't afford to live there anymore. So other people who could afford to live there, they moved into that neighborhood. Right? So that neighborhood is different. But then also, now Chinatown is different too, because I'm running around there on Parnell Street. So I'm sort of there in the local takeaway shop now more recently. So you see two things happen. The neighborhood composition changed from the neighborhood that I left, but it also changed the neighborhood composition of where I moved. Right? So these are the two things where others are affected by my single decision to make a move. And now these dynamics kick in, because now other people, let's say in the Grand Canal Docks area, they said, oh yeah, this used to be like a cool place, but now that's I don't know, I don't really like it anymore either, right? Or I don't know, or in the neighborhood that I moved in, suddenly I'm changing the composition there, and now other things in the neighborhood, okay, well, now the professors from UCD, they move in, so maybe this is becoming a safe area, which it is, I hope. So you see, this kind of then affects others. And now we're talking about, now a lot of things come together that we talked about in this lecture, because now thresholds come into play. Yeah? Maybe some people that would have not moved into D1, now the situation changed a little bit. So maybe now they move in. And once they move in, well, the situation changes again. Then maybe somebody else moves in. And actually that's what we observe in cities all the time. You observe that all the time, that certain neighborhoods, they are dodgy, and at some point some people move in, oftentimes because, I don't know, this is what they can afford, it brings a different crowd in, whatnot, suddenly the thing gets an uplift, and at some point it becomes super expensive to live there, right? So this is sort of like something that totally happens. And now you see these dynamics, they occur on the destination side, but they also occur at the side of when you move out of a neighborhood. Imagine you move out of a neighborhood, and suddenly that neighborhood, because you're not there anymore, has a different feel to it. Others experience that. And now maybe others were happy to live there, but now you're gone. Now they feel like, oh, I'm not that happy anymore here either. And this is now, to kind of study these kind of things, this is where agent-based models come into play. Well, you have more modules about that if you're interested in that. The social data analytics folks, you have like a module by Pablo taught about that later on. It'll come back to you again and again and again. What this basically is, it's like a way, these are processes that we now can simulate. You can see what would happen. How would those dynamics actually play out? If I move out and that affects somebody else, and that affects somebody else, and that affects somebody else, and so on. Right? So agent-based models are simulation models or techniques where a system is modeled as a collection of agents and the relations between them. Agents individually assess their situation and their environment and make decisions on the basis of a set of rules, and often they're highly stylized and abstract. So these things are very abstract things right now. Yeah? But it's like oftentimes the core of it is extremely simple. The core of it is extremely simple, like I want to live in a neighborhood with at least, let's say, 30% similar people around me. That's the rule. And as soon as my neighborhood changes, as soon as there are only 25% similar people around me, I say goodbye. I go somewhere else. Right? And for that, I have a little example for you now. We'll come back to that. There's a little teaser for what's going to come on Thursday. What you see here now, this is actually now an agent-based model. It's actually a software. It's called NetLogo. It's a very simple software. It's very straightforward. It's not that complicated. And you see here now a world. And it's like very artificial, very stylized. Yeah? Like a world, we have like red and green individuals in that world. And you see like some black spots. These are the empty neighborhoods. Think about it. These are the open, I don't know, the houses that are for sale. Yeah? While the reds and the greens is the individuals occupying certain houses. It's very stylized, the whole thing. Yeah? And I can set it up. So that means I kind of randomly assign those individuals somewhere. And now the simulation comes into play. I can set this up again. I don't know, this is another random allocation or whatnot. And then I can repeat these kind of things. Okay, so the density, let's not worry about that. It's really just how many of those black things are there. If I would go down in density, there would be more blacks. If I go up 100, I don't know, there are no empty spaces, basically. Okay, so now but the key thing here now is the following. Now let's set up our individuals in such a way that they are happy as long as there are at least 30% similar individuals around them. So that means like, I'm actually really happy with living in a majority non-green neighborhood when I'm green. I'm actually happy with up to 70% red individuals living around me when I'm green. I'm tolerant. But as soon as, I want to have at least some people around me who are similar to me. But actually, I would be fine. Actually, these models have been extended to that I would even prefer to live in neighborhoods that are sort of mixed. Yeah? But as soon as, let's say, a minimum number is sort of reached, I say, okay, well, now it's maybe time for me to go as well. Maybe the world changed so much. That's now our very simple rule. And according to that rule, you see now those individuals here, they little patches representing individuals. Some of them have a little X on it. What that X means is that according to that rule, they are unhappy. Yeah? So let's find one unhappy individual. That guy is unhappy. When you zoom in, you'll see the guy has like, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 green individuals in the neighborhood. The neighborhood here is defined as the Moore neighborhood, but let's not worry about these kind of things. But only one other red individual, which adds up to less than 30%. Yeah? So that guy is unhappy. Somebody else, this guy is also unhappy. This guy is unhappy. Now what we can do, okay, now let's move this unhappy guy. Say, okay, well, I'm in the housing market. I'm going to find another neighborhood, one of those empty spots where I just randomly move. I don't even care about whether I'm happy there. I just go. I just go somewhere else. You could even have it that they care about that neighborhood and they specifically select them. That just amplifies the process. But this is like a more conservative one, right? So they could still end up in a different neighborhood. They just move. So now what happened, they kind of changed the composition here and they changed the composition over there where they left. Yeah. And now somebody else became unhappy in that neighborhood, and maybe somebody else became unhappy in that neighborhood. Yeah. And now if you kind of run that, so now what happens is, now it's just, I don't know, it's just randomly one unhappy individual being selected, yeah, and they move somewhere else, and this process goes on and on and on, and actually what you see here now is different kind of things. It's like the average percent of similar individuals around individuals. Remember, they are happy with 30% individuals, but somehow segregation goes up. Yeah? We have less and less unhappy people, but even this very simple rule that I'm fine with up to 70% dissimilar people around me leads to a pretty segregated world when you look at that right now. And now we're at the stage where on average people are surrounded by 75% similar individuals, even though they would have been happy with 30%. Okay, so that's basically Schelling's segregation model, and we'll talk more about that on Thursday. If you haven't done the reading, that's the same reading that you guys had to do for today.